In one apocalyptic moment of cosmic horror, an ancient empire died. The skies above Eldar worlds split open, and a newborn god, unleashed by the Eldar's own boundless excesses, ripped the souls from trillions of unsuspecting Eldar in an instant. Once glittering cities fell silent, their streets suddenly littered with lifeless husks as this new deity feasted on the collective lust and pride of a fallen race. This cataclysm was not caused by an invading armada or a natural calamity. It was the Eldar's own doing, an annihilation brought about by nothing more and nothing less than their unquenchable pursuit of pleasure. This is the story of how pleasure destroyed the Eldar Empire. This may sound like an exaggeration, but it isn't. The Eldar essentially partied themselves to death, unleashing a calamity of their own making. To understand how such a thing could happen, we must first look back to the very height of Eldar civilization, the zenith of their triumph before the long fall into night. The Golden Age of the Eldar. Long before their fall, the Eldar were nothing short of Yaz among the stars. They are an unimaginably ancient species, older than humanity can readily comprehend. While early humans were still learning to walk upright and make fire, the Eldar had already built starships and woven wonders across the galaxy. They found themselves virtually unopposed. In mythic times, the Eldar had been created and guided by an even older race, the Old Ones, to fight a primordial war against the Necrontire, ancient android beings. When that great war in heaven ended eons ago, and the Old Ones disappeared, the Eldar inherited a galaxy ripe for their taking. Their ancient enemies, the Necrons, had gone into hibernation in hidden tomb worlds, and no other young species yet posed a threat. Thus, at their empire's height, the Eldar truly had no equal. They ruled the stars as they pleased. Eldar society reached heights of sophistication and power that defy belief. With their unparalleled grasp of science and psychic arts, the Eldar could reshape matter and energy at will. If an Eldar needed something, food, tools, art, they could simply think it into existence or command automata to craft it. Their starships slipped between worlds through shimmering portals in the webway, a secret network of extra-dimensional pathways that only they knew how to navigate. Through these hidden gates, distance became almost meaningless. An Eldar could step from one side of the galaxy to the other without ever exposing themselves to the dangers of warp travel. On idyllic colony planets, they constructed cities of breathtaking beauty, true paradises where every need was met and every citizen could devote themselves to art, knowledge, and personal fulfillment. For example, on the Eldar crown world Belial IV, a central hub of their empire, the entire planet was effectively a work of art. Its capital city spanned hundreds of kilometers, an elegant expanse of wraithbone spires and crystal domes woven seamlessly with greenery and waterfalls. Belial IV's Grand Plaza alone could hold millions of Eldar for celebrations. It was lined with statues of heroes and philosophers, carved with such skill that they seemed alive. The planet's continents were dotted with pleasure gardens, learning temples, and amphitheaters where the Eldar performed dramas and music that could stir the soul. It was a world where every sunrise was met with poetry and every sunset with song, a utopia in every sense. Tragically, Belial IV would later be one of the worlds at ground zero of the fall, but during the Golden Age, such doom was inconceivable to its inhabitants. In those glory days, the Eldar lived lives of leisure, enlightenment, and seemingly endless time. They were extraordinarily long-lived, effectively immortal, barring fatal accidents or violence. Sickness and age never withered them. An Eldar who appeared youthful might in fact be tens of thousands of years old. Physically, they were as splendid as their cities, Tall, lithe, and graceful, with keen senses and intellects far beyond those of mortal humans. Each Eldar was born with an innate connection to psychic power, their soul shining brightly in the immaterium, the warp. This spiritual energy infused everything they did. They could intuit truths, communicate telepathically, and even mold matter or heal wounds with but a thought. Culturally, they devoted themselves to the pursuit of excellence in all things. Many Eldar spent decades or centuries mastering a single art or discipline, pouring their heightened emotions and skill into creating works of sublime genius. They sculpted statues that practically lived, composed music that could bring one to tears, and devised technologies so advanced they appeared as magic. With their long view of time, an Eldar could afford to perfect every endeavor. For millions of years, the Eldar reigned supreme. They had no equal in the galaxy. The ancient Necron dynasties slept beneath the ground, and younger races had barely emerged from the mud. In the Eldar's eyes, all other beings were crude, short-lived monkeys, a derogatory term meaning monkeys or barbarians. And to be fair, this arrogance seemed justified. Eldar science and psionic might allow them to toy with the fabric of reality itself. They could quench the light of a star or reignite it on a whim. They terraformed planets like a gardener tending a flower bed. It was said, only slightly poetically, that the Eldar's mere dreams could topple mountains or stir the winds on distant worlds. Their technology was so advanced it appeared miraculous. Self-aware constructs and wraith-bone engines that responded to spoken thoughts. The Eldar created countless beautiful things and lived in peace and plenty. Importantly, the Eldar had long overcome the need for physical labor or survival-driven toil. Their automated systems and psychic talents provided all necessities. Even military conquest, should it ever be required, was often carried out by their machine creations and biomechanical servitors. War, on the rare occasions it arose, was almost a formality. Any external enemy was swept aside with minimal Eldar effort, often by dread weapons or artificial warriors of their own making. Thus, for the average Eldar citizen in the Empire's zenith, life was essentially free of hardship. They had luxury and time in abundance, to the point that every individual could focus entirely on pursuing their own interests, passions, and curiosities. When an Eldar died, by accident or on the rare occasion of violence, their spirits simply returned to the warp. In those early times, the Eldar believed their souls would eventually be reincarnated or find their way to the tranquil realm of their gods. Death held little fear for them. It was seen as a natural transition, perhaps even a temporary one. With such an outlook and such mastery over existence, the Eldar felt secure that their golden age would last forever. On any given Eldar world at this time, the day-to-day existence was tranquil and enlightened. Imagine a city where gleaming towers of wraithbone cast rainbows in the warm sunlight. In the morning, Eldar academicians might convene in lush hanging gardens to debate philosophy and mathematics for the sheer joy of knowledge, their laughter echoing alongside the songs of psychically crafted birds. Nearby, artisans could be found psychically coaxing intricate sculptures from living crystal, while across the plaza, musicians performed melodies on instruments that resonated directly with the player's emotions. In the afternoon, perhaps a troupe of dancers would take to the streets, their movements so graceful and precise that they seemed to defy gravity, and citizens would pause their own pursuits to watch, appreciating the artistry with sincere delight. There was no toil, no want, no worry over resources or survival. An Eldar might spend a decade perfecting a single poem or painting, or engage in friendly competitions of creativity and intellect that lasted weeks, all without any concern for material needs. Every aspect of life was elevated to an art form. This was a society reveling in its own perfection, enjoying the fruits of triumphs won long ago. It was, for a time, truly idyllic, yet beneath the gleaming surface of this seemingly perfect civilization, the seeds of its downfall were quietly taking root. Even in ages past, there had been whispers of caution. Legends in Eldar myth spoke of a shadow that would come if they ever lost their way. It is said the Old Ones, those primordial architects of the Eldar race, once warned their children of the doom that hubris could bring. But such warnings were ancient and half forgotten by the time the Eldar Empire stood at its zenith. An old Eldar proverb went, "Only in darkness does one remember the light." Sadly, the Elder would only remember their teacher's wisdom after it was far too late. With nothing apparent to challenge them and nothing beyond their grasp, the Eldar began to lose something vital: purpose. When a people can have anything they desire at a whim, when there are no wars left to fight, no hardships left to overcome, a great emptiness can form in the soul. Boredom and arrogance became the Empire's unseen poison. The Eldar had conquered the galaxy and mastered its secrets. Now, with no new worlds to test them, they turned inward. Existence itself became a playground for their whims. It was a subtle and gradual shift, so slow that at first, perhaps only a few even noticed the path they were on. But the path was leading inexorably toward darkness. In hindsight, the Eldar's biggest enemy was their own success. They just didn't realize it yet. The higher they climbed, the further they had to fall, and fall they would. Descent into decadence. The change began subtly. With no external challenges left, more and more Eldar turned to the one frontier they hadn't fully explored, the limits of their own experiences. What started as harmless indulgence, grand festivals, celebrations of art and sensation, slowly slid towards something darker. Over centuries, indulgence became obsession. Small sects arose dedicated entirely to the pursuit of pleasure in all its forms. These were the infamous pleasure cults, loose gatherings of Eldar who sought to experience every feeling imaginable, every stimulation the mind and body could endure. At first, their activities might have seemed like mere eccentricities of the bored elite, extravagant parties lasting weeks on end, decadent feasts where every dish was a new culinary ecstasy, intricate immersive art performances where participants lost themselves in mind-altering substances and psychic trances. But as time went on, these cults pushed their pursuits to extremes that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Over the course of centuries, the corruption that began as a few isolated cults metastasized throughout Eldar society. At first, perhaps only a daring or degenerate minority dabbled in the most forbidden pleasures, while the majority of Eldar still held to more dignified pursuits. But as the millennia passed, the allure of the cults proved irresistible to more and more of the population. Slowly, the magnificence of the Eldar Empire gave way to corruption, indolence, and spiritual decay as many gave in to hedonistic desire. One world after another succumbed to the siren call of indulgence. Noble houses that once patronized only high art and learning began sponsoring grotesque festivals of sensation instead. The guardians of law and tradition grew complacent or apathetic, unwilling or unable to stem the rising tide of anarchy. Pleasure cults sprang up across Eldar territories, and the pantheon of Eldar gods was gradually abandoned in favor of personal deification through insane excess. Many Eldar began to think they themselves could become like gods by experiencing everything. By the final era before the fall, mere centuries before the catastrophe, the pleasure cults were no longer fringe sects hiding in the shadows. They dominated society on the Eldar homeworlds. What was once fringe had become fashionable. What was once taboo had become tradition. Entire generations were born into a society that celebrated excess as the highest good. Those few voices that still urged restraint or warned of spiritual danger were shouted down or laughed off. The momentum of doom was building, unstoppable. In effect, the Eldar civilization had turned into a runaway train of debauchery, hurtling toward disaster with no brakes and no one left willing to try and slow it down. Eldar senses and emotions have always run deeper and sharper than those of most races. An Eldar's joy is more radiant, their sorrow more profound, and their desires more intense than any human's. So when they set out to feel pleasure, they did so with a dedication and creativity that defied any moral restraint. The pleasures they chased became increasingly perverse. They sought the fine line where delight and pain blur together, and then they crossed far beyond it. Acts that would be repugnant or taboo to any sane society gradually became routine among the Eldar elite. All across their worlds, the unthinkable became the everyday. Grand palaces that once hosted celestial poetry readings now held blood-soaked banquets of depravity. It was not uncommon for a gathering to climax with orgiastic violence, participants slaying one another for the slightest thrill. There are tales of Eldar who would literally feast on the flesh of their fallen kin in such moments, roasting and consuming corpses as if part of some art performance. Entire districts became charnel houses where the streets ran red with blood. In colosseums that had once seen refined cultural pageants, howling crowds now gathered to witness and partake in ritualistic murder. The bestial roar of those frenzied audiences could be heard echoing for miles, drowning out any last vestige of sanity. Planets burned with the fires of rioting pleasure seekers. Beautiful parks and plazas were turned into arenas of torture and sadism. As simpler delights failed to satisfy their jaded senses, the pleasure cults found new, darker outlets. Violence and cruelty became just another form of stimulation. Pain was discovered to be as potent as pleasure. In the right context to the corrupted mind, the two could even become indistinguishable. Elegant poets turned into sadistic killers prowling the streets in search of victims, attempting to find new ways to satisfy their warped needs. Torture became an art form. Murder became the ultimate performance piece. In private galleries, gruesome exhibits displayed victims artfully mutilated, their agonies drawn out as a form of high entertainment. Bloodsport arenas sprang up where spectators cheered as volunteers and captives alike experienced exquisite suffering and ecstasy indistinguishably intertwined. The line between artist and murderer blurred, as taking a life in the most outlandishly inventive way was celebrated as a masterpiece. Imagine an entire civilization gradually embracing this madness, neighborhoods transformed into playgrounds of depravity, once idyllic pleasure gardens now hosting deadly hunts at midnight. Beautiful civic plazas stained with blood from ritual killings carried out in broad daylight, all in the name of experiencing everything that life has to offer. Traditional Eldar values and beliefs were the next casualties of this cultural collapse. The Eldar pantheon of gods, once central to their identity, was increasingly forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant. Temples to deities like Surian, Isha, and Cain fell silent, or worse, were repurposed as venues for depravity rather than reverence. The sacred rituals and festivals of old were replaced by the new rites of the pleasure cults. Why venerate higher powers or heed ancient moral teachings when one could feel like a god oneself, a master of one's own sensations? Many Eldar effectively began worshipping nothing but their own desires. In chasing this personal divinity through indulgence, they severed the last ties to restraint and virtue that their traditions once provided. Soon, even these excesses failed to satisfy the jaded population. The palette of sensations had to keep expanding. Simple joys turned dull, so they hungered for the novel, the shocking, the extreme. Some sects even pursued arcane and scientific perversions in their quest for new extremes. They dabbled in forbidden technologies and occult rituals, twisting the laws of nature for amusement. In hidden laboratories, Eldar experimented on living subjects, splicing beings together or warping flesh into grotesque new forms simply to savor the outre results. Others devised psychoactive devices, machines that could overload the senses or torture the mind, and eagerly wired themselves in, pushing their consciousness to the brink of madness and back again for the sake of a fresh thrill. No taboo was off limits. What was forbidden yesterday became the thrill of today. Soon the streets were literally running with blood, and the bestial roar of the crowds could be heard across entire cities. Law and order could not survive such rampant corruption. The institutions of the Eldar Empire, councils, courts, and elder hierarchies had no chance of holding society together when the majority no longer cared for any principle beyond indulging themselves. Governmental functions collapsed or became irrelevant. Many officials themselves were likely members of pleasure cults or victims of them. Any leaders or officials who did try to enforce order were swiftly silenced, often violently. Trying to stop the tide of excess became a quick way to meet a poetic end at the hands of a pleasure-crazed mob. Why bother enforcing laws or maintaining infrastructure when one could be off chasing the next debauchery? On world after world, any remaining voices of reason were drowned out, sometimes literally in blood. The streets descended into chaos, a carnival of atrocity. At the height of the degeneration, entire city blocks might spend their days in an unending orgy of sensation, then spill into the night with roving bands of delirious Eldar seeking fresh thrills. Screams of agony and ecstasy echoed through empty halls of governance and learning, now abandoned in favor of darker passions. What had been a unified interstellar empire fractured into countless little fiefdoms of vice, each neighborhood or clique following its own twisted appetites. No one could see, or perhaps no one cared, that their civilization was destroying itself. Yet it would be wrong to say that every Eldar gladly embraced this descent. There were those who resisted, who looked around in horror and saw the once noble culture of their people crumbling. Some Eldar retained enough moral clarity to feel disgust at the excess surrounding them. Religious and cultural traditionalists tried to pull society back from the brink. Among them, the Harlequins, itinerant entertainers and storytellers devoted to the trickster god Segorok, the laughing god. The Harlequins traveled from city to city, performing ancient dances and cautionary mythic plays, seeking to remind the Eldar of all they were abandoning. They reenacted the old legends and showed symbolic visions of the doom that indulgence would bring. But to a populace reveling in ceaseless indulgence, these warnings fell on deaf ears. If anything, the decadent Eldar found the Harlequins' morbid morality plays amusing at best, or irritating at worst, an unwelcome interruption of their fun. A plea for moderation was the last thing anyone wanted to hear in the middle of the galaxy's wildest party. Others took more drastic action. They chose flight over futile protest. Small numbers of Eldar decided to leave their homeworlds altogether, convinced that their civilization was doomed if it continued on this path. These exiles were often mocked by the majority, derided as prudes and fanatics obsessed with self-denial. Indeed, that is exactly what they intended to become. They deliberately sought out hardship and simplicity, hoping to save themselves from the creeping rot of decadence. In what came to be known as the Great Exodus, these dissenters fled to the very edges of the galaxy. They boarded generation ships or repurposed trading vessels and set course for distant, unsettled planets, far from the Eldar Empire's core. On these remote, maiden worlds, the refugees founded new colonies, choosing lives of agrarian simplicity and austere discipline. They became known as the Exodites, those who exited the Eldar paradise to escape its curse. Their lives on the frontier were hard and unadorned compared to the luxuries of old, but they saw this as a small price to pay for keeping their souls untainted. In some places, their departure was harrowing. Families who had resisted the decadence stole through crowds of rioters and narcotized revelers to reach the docking spires where the great colony vessels waited. Picture an Eldar mother and father guiding their children through streets littered with the glittering debris of endless revelry, shielding the little one's eyes from scenes of grotesque violence as they hurry toward the last shuttle off-world. Around them, former friends and neighbors, now lost to madness, either beg them to stay, don't abandon the fun, or curse them as cowards for fleeing. At the spaceport, tense guardians, struggling not to succumb to the psychic malaise themselves, usher the refugees aboard amid whispered prayers. Some hedonists even attempt to sabotage the launches, seeing the fleeing Eldar as traitors to the wild freedom that had consumed everyone else. In at least one instance, violence breaks out on the loading gantry as a pleasure-crazed mob tries to storm a departing ship, only to be repelled by those determined to escape. Once aboard, the lucky few found a measure of safety. Through the wraithbone hull of a departing Craftworld ark, a refugee might gaze down at their homeworld one last time. What had once been a jewel of civilization was now marred by spreading fires and chaos. Imagine that final heart-wrenching view: city blocks burning, elegant spires toppled or ablaze, and the sky above the capital boiling with unnatural energies. With tears in their eyes, these survivors turned away from the sight, and the Craftworld's engines carried them out into the stars. They left behind everything: friends and family who refused to listen, the graves of their ancestors, the great cities built over millennia, all of it doomed. The great ships slipped away one by one into the void, bearing the last hope of the Eldar race on board. For every Eldar who chose exile, however, hundreds more stayed behind, plunging deeper into corruption. The vast majority of the population either could not see the danger or simply didn't care. Things had not completely fallen apart. Not yet. Many Eldar still lived relatively normal lives amid the Empire, not personally joining murder cults or obscene orgies. But even these apathetic souls did nothing to stop the downward spiral. Perhaps they assumed this was just a phase of cultural experimentation, and that their immortal society could handle any excess. Perhaps they were numb or too mildly indulgent to object to the greater crimes around them. In any case, the collective momentum was dragging the entire species toward an abyss, and no one and nothing could stop it. Indeed, all the warning signs were there, quite literally screaming in their faces or haunting their dreams. But as a whole, the Eldar were far past heeding warnings. The Eldar Empire was rotting from within, and a terrible fate was about to befall them, born entirely of their own actions. The coming doom. All the while, as the Eldar reveled in decadence, a storm was gathering, both figuratively and literally. Unbeknownst to them, their excesses were having profound effects beyond the material world. In the universe of Warhammer 40,000, strong emotions and violent deaths don't just vanish. They echo into the immaterium, the psychic dimension known as the warp. The Eldar, being highly psychic, had always left an imprint on the warp when they felt or did anything. Now, with billions of Eldar experiencing extremes of agony and ecstasy, and so many being brutally killed in orgiastic bloodshed, the warp heaved with turmoil. The once calm psychic tides became churning maelstroms, reflecting the collective degeneration of the Eldar soul. Unnatural warp storms began to flicker at the fringes of reality, especially around the Eldar homeworlds. These storms disrupted interstellar travel and communications for those who relied on the warp. Incidentally, this development would isolate and devastate humanity's nascent interstellar colonies, ushering in what humans later called the Age of Strife, though the Eldar at the time paid little heed to the troubles of lesser species. But the Eldar themselves were largely unbothered. They hardly needed the warp for travel when they had their webway gates. They remained oblivious to the cosmic warning signs of what was coming. The Eldar's metaphysical environment was becoming poisoned by their actions. In the immaterium, the psychic reflections of their boundless lust and cruelty were coalescing, slowly taking shape into something truly monstrous. One might imagine it as a psychic fetus gestating in the womb of the warp, formed from the gestalt of trillions of depraved thoughts and experiences. This embryonic entity stirred fitfully in its sleep, dimly aware and growing stronger by the day. Every new atrocity in real space fed it. Every soul that died in the height of passion or pain drifted into the warp and was absorbed into this developing mass of power. For centuries, it swelled larger, an unformed godling nourished by endless sin. As the Eldar Empire hurtled toward disaster, the physical universe and the warp alike became increasingly unstable. The deaths of hundreds of thousands, eventually millions, of Eldar in extremely pleasurable and/or painful ways had an unintended and catastrophic side effect. Their freed souls and psychic agonies caused the formation of terrible warp disturbances. Uncontrolled warp storms raged across the galaxy, isolating worlds and making warp travel, used by other races like humans, nearly impossible. The Eldar themselves hardly noticed or cared, since they traveled via the webway. But these storms were a direct consequence of their society's self-destruction. Far worse, the souls of the dead Eldar were not simply dissipating into the warp as they used to. They were somehow coalescing into a larger presence, a living psychic entity embodying the corruption that had claimed their lives. As more and more Eldar died to fuel the decadence, this entity continued to grow, and the warp storms grew ever more severe. In the final years, and even days, before the cataclysm, signs of impending doom became impossible to ignore, at least for those not entirely lost in debauchery. Across the Eldar Empire, more and more individuals began to suffer strange mental maladies. Some were plagued by horrific nightmares they could not escape, even when awake, visions of a great hungering darkness, or of disembodied laughter echoing from the void. Others, especially those with strong psychic gifts, succumbed to sudden fits of madness or despair. It was as if some immense pressure was building up in the collective Eldar mind, a deafening psychic scream on the verge of breaking through. In truth, that is exactly what it was. The unborn god in the warp was nearing the moment of its birth, and its prenatal dreams were already leaking into the minds of its creators. Eldar seers later recounted the harrowing visions that haunted this period. Dreams of a monstrous entity stirring in an endless abyss, its form indistinct, but its malevolent thirst palpable. Some dreamed of a seductive figure cloaked in swirling colors, who beckoned them closer only to turn into a fanged shadow that swallowed the stars. Others saw blood-red skies and heard a chorus of laughter that turned into screams. One famous account tells of an Eldar poet who awoke from a nightmare in which she wandered through a city of glass, and suddenly every pane of glass shattered, and in each jagged shard she glimpsed the reflection of a grinning, inhuman face staring back at her. These premonitions were fragmentary and cryptic, but all shared a sense of dreadful inevitability. A few sensitive souls tried to warn that these visions were not merely the byproduct of collective insanity. They were genuine omens of something awful coalescing in the immaterium, readying to be born. But their warnings could not cut through the cacophony of excess surrounding them. A few Eldar, still sane and vigilant, realized that a cataclysm was coming. Perhaps on some level, even the worst of the degenerates felt a twinge of fear or premonition in those final moments. But by then, it was too late to stop what had been set in motion. Earlier, a handful of courageous Eldar had even attempted to avert the coming catastrophe. They convened councils, delivered dire prophecies, and begged their fellows to turn away from the path of damnation while there was still time. These last-minute efforts were met mostly with scorn or indifference. Many pleasure-addled Eldar simply laughed at the notion of restraint or accused the warners of spreading needless fear. In some cases, the pleasure cults took violent exception to anyone threatening their lifestyle. More than one would-be reformer was quietly assassinated or dragged into the streets and torn apart by a frenzied mob. It is said that a particularly gifted seer named Eldar Ulthran saw the inevitability of the fall with painful clarity. Gathering those who would listen, he secretly coordinated an escape mission, rather than waste further time preaching to the doomed. But such instances were few. For the vast majority of Eldar society, no warning, no matter how dire, would turn them from their course. The best anyone could do now was run. Thus, a final wave of refugees prepared to flee the impending disaster. These were not the Hedonists. By and large, they were members of the old Eldar aristocracy, priesthoods, and intelligentsia who had resisted the excess, or at least tried to moderate it. With heavy hearts, they concluded that their worlds were beyond saving. If they stayed, they would share in the doom that was about to engulf their people. In secrecy or under perilous conditions, these survivors-to-be boarded colossal starships known as Craftworlds. Originally, Craftworlds had been city-sized vessels roaming the stars, trading ships or exploratory craft that connected the far-flung Eldar colonies. Now they became lifeboats for civilization. The evacuees loaded the Craftworlds with as much of their culture and wealth as they could. Libraries of lore, art, and artifacts, plants and animals from their home ecologies, entire slices of their homeworld's environments. They carried whatever physical memory of their glory they could, as if hoping to transplant a piece of their lost world onto new soil. As the Craftworld fleets slipped away into the void, leaving behind the gleaming, if increasingly blood-stained, cities of old, the revels and horrors on the core worlds reached a crescendo. It was as if the insane energies of an entire species peaked at the same moment, a last orgiastic frenzy of unchecked sensation before oblivion. And oblivion was now only moments away. The storm broke at last, and the fate of the Eldar was sealed. The final bill for millions of years of indulgence was about to come due with interest. The Fall, Birth of a Dark God. Then, without further warning, it happened. The psychic pressure that had been building reached its apex, and the immaterial levee finally broke. In the early 30th millennium of the Terran calendar, by human reckoning, though dates meant nothing to the doomed Eldar in that instant, the being that the Eldar's sins had nurtured awoke. With a howling psychic scream, the newborn Chaos God burst forth into consciousness. This was Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess, the perfect prince, the dark prince, she who thirsts, the great enemy that the Eldar had unknowingly created for themselves. On the Eldar homeworlds, the moment of Slaanesh's birth was cataclysmic beyond measure. One heartbeat, everything was as it had been. Decadent revels, violence, laughter, and screams echoing under alien skies. The next heartbeat, those skies split open, boiling with warp energy. A wave of psychic force invisible to the eye but felt in the soul swept across the worlds. Every Eldar, from the greatest lords to the lowliest pleasure seeker, felt a sudden grip of icy ecstasy and terror clamp down on their very essence. Time seemed to freeze in an awful instant of absolute clarity as an unimaginable presence made itself known. Many Eldar looked up and, whether in the sky or in the recesses of their own minds, perceived a colossal shadow looming over them, a figure of awful splendor and cruelty smiling down. It was the face of the god their depravity had birthed, and in that final moment they understood, too late, what was upon them. Slaanesh's first act was as simple as it was horrific. It inhaled. The newborn god drew in a great breath, and as it did, the souls of the Eldar were ripped from their bodies en masse. All across the Eldar Empire, billions upon billions of lives winked out in an instant, their spirits sucked into the gaping maw of she who thirsts. Imagine the brightest bonfire suddenly snuffed to embers. That was the psychic light of the Eldar race being devoured. Those Eldar who had been deep in their debaucheries suddenly found themselves dying in rapturous agony. Their final screams of terror twisted into wails of ecstasy as Slaanesh's influence warped their emotions at the moment of death. In a sick irony, many Eldar died experiencing the greatest high of their lives, the touch of a god, even as that god consumed them whole. One eyewitness account, preserved by the Harlequins in later years, describes a decadent Eldar prince in the midst of an opulent sacrificial ceremony at the fateful moment. One instant he stood atop a dais in a pleasure hall, surrounded by music and delirious laughter, poised to plunge a blade into a victim's heart. The next instant he froze. The prince's ecstatic grin faltered, his eyes widened in bewilderment, and the jeweled dagger slipped from his grasp. An indescribable expression crossed his face, rapturous bliss colliding with abject horror as his soul was suddenly wrenched out of his body. He was dead before he hit the ground, his once splendid form now an empty husk. All around him, every other reveler in that grand hall similarly dropped lifeless where they stood, snuffed out in a single transcendent moment of terror and delight. Bodies fell in the street, drained of spirit and animation as the demon god fed. The streets of every Eldar city became carpeted with corpses. Ornate anti-gravity ships that had been sailing the skies plummeted in flames, their pilots and crews dead at the helm. Vehicles careened off crystal roads as their drivers were absorbed into the presence of the newborn deity. In mere moments, almost the entire Eldar civilization was annihilated, not by some external foe's conquest or a supernova's blast, but by the concentrated psychic backlash of their own making. Those far from the epicenter fared little better. The shockwave of Slaanesh's birth rippled outward at the speed of thought. Eldar on distant colonies light years away clutched their chests and collapsed, their souls already forfeit. Even members of other species across the galaxy felt the reverberations. Human psychers and sensitive individuals were driven insane or killed outright by the psychic tsunami that rolled through the warp. The few who survived to tell the tale, none of them Eldar, would later speak of a sudden vision of monstrous radiance, of laughter echoing in their minds, and a sensation of bottomless thirst and longing that was not their own. And what of the fleeing Eldar on their Craftworld ships and far-flung colonies? They too did not escape unscathed. On several Craftworld vessels that were still in transit, far from the Empire's core, Eldar psychers howled and collapsed as the psychic scream reached them. Many who had only minor psychic ability felt an overwhelming pain flood their minds. Some died on the spot, their spirits yanked from them even at extreme range. Others survived, but were driven into comas or madness, their minds shattered by the distant echo of Slaanesh's birth. The infinity circuits of those craft worlds, the wraithbone cores that hold and channel Eldar souls, flickered chaotically, suddenly glutted with an overload of newly departed souls. Whole sections of ships went silent as Eldar there simply fell lifeless, victims of an enemy they could not even see. Though the craft worlds themselves remained intact, the survivors aboard were left trembling and terrified, immediately aware that something unspeakable had occurred back home. Reality itself buckled under the strain of Slaanesh's violent birth. Where the heart of the Eldar Empire had once been, there was now a growing wound in the fabric of space. The howling spiritual energy of billions of souls being consumed caused the warp to punch through into real space. In a single thunderclap of unreal light, a gigantic rift opened, swallowing hundreds of Eldar worlds in an instant. The immaterium and the material universe bled together, transforming that region into a hellish domain of chaos. This would forever after be known as the Eye of Terror, a vast permanent warp storm and a grave marker for a civilization. The Eldar homeworlds, once paradise planets of culture and enlightenment, were now twisted into demon-haunted wastelands. They became the Crone worlds, cursed places where the remains of those planets exist within the warp itself, populated only by echoes of despair and the predatory demons that now infest them. An area almost 20,000 light-years across was engulfed by the warp's eruption. Where once Eldar cities stood, now there is only the bizarre, impossible landscape of chaos, an open wound upon reality that weeps corruption into the galaxy to this day. As if the slaughter of trillions of Eldar were not enough, Slaanesh's appetite was only just awakening. The new god's gaze turned toward the Eldar's immortal deities, the very gods the Eldar had long worshipped and, in recent times, forsaken. In the warp, the spiritual realm where those gods existed, a massacre of divinities now took place. The Eldar gods, already drastically weakened by the loss of their faithful and the psychic trauma of their people's extinction, stood little chance against the young, voracious power that was Slaanesh. One by one, the members of the Eldar pantheon fell. The goddess of dreams, Lilith, the celestial king, Asurion, the hunt god Kurnaus, the smith Vol, the healing mother goddess Isha, the crone Morai Heg, all were devoured or destroyed by Slaanesh's onslaught. The Prince of Excess took them as the ultimate dessert after feasting on a whole species. The only known survivors of this divine carnage were two, Kala Mensha Kain, the bloody-handed god of war, and Kegorash, the laughing god of mischief. Kane actually confronted Slaanesh in an epic battle in the warp, the war god furious and ready to avenge his children. He struck mighty blows and the newborn Slaanesh reeled. But Slaanesh was already engorged with the power of 1 billion souls, and even Kane could not withstand the onslaught. The duel was titanic, Kane wreathed in fire and fury, Slaanesh radiant with newly gained power, and for a time neither could gain the upper hand. But Slaanesh's strength swelled with every passing moment as more Eldar souls poured into it, while Kain's might waned with the death of his followers. Some Eldar legends say that another chaos god, Horn, the blood god, intervened at the last moment out of hatred for Slaanesh and a desire to claim Kane for himself. Whatever the cause, Kane was not consumed. Instead, he was broken. Slaanesh tore Kane's being into 1,000 shards and hurled them out of the warp. Those fragments of the war god eventually found refuge in the surviving Eldar craft worlds as the avatars of Cain, living statues of iron slumbering at the heart of each craft world, the last faint embers of a defeated god's rage. The other survivor, the laughing god Segorch, escaped by wit and luck. He fled deep into the labyrinthine pathways of the webway beyond Slaanesh's reach. It's yet he hides there still, shepherding the souls of the few Eldar who stay faithful to him, such as the Harlequins, forever playing a cosmic game of hide-and-seek with She Who Thirsts. When the carnage finally subsided, Silence and stillness fell across what remained of the Eldar worlds. The great orgy of existence had ended in utter ruin. Where once teemed trillions of lives, now there was deathly quiet. The Eldar race, proud, ancient, and mighty, had virtually annihilated itself in a final paroxysm of excess. Slaanesh sat bloated on the psychic remains of an entire people, newly ascended to godhood, its laughter echoing across the warp. The fall of the Eldar, as this disaster would be called by those who came after, was complete. In a perverse cosmic irony, the Eldar had managed to do to themselves what no external enemy ever could, and they paid for it with everything. Aftermath. A dying people. In the wake of that nightmarish event, the few Eldar who survived were left to grapple with unimaginable trauma and loss. On the fleeing Craftworld ships that had not been caught in the catastrophe, Eldar who escaped watched in horror as news spread that their homeworlds were gone, consumed by a warp rift that now glared in the void like a malevolent new star. Some among them simply succumbed to despair or madness. Others steeled themselves to try and rebuild something from the ashes. The Exodite colonies on distant worlds fared slightly better, while many of them felt the psychic shock and lost loved ones. Their isolation and simpler lifestyles spared them the worst of the soul drain. On those quiet frontier planets, small communities of Eldar awoke to a galaxy suddenly made far emptier and colder, clinging to their austere new traditions with renewed fervor. Many simply could not withstand the psychic anguish that followed. Some Eldar sank into catatonic despair, and a few even chose to release their spirits into death rather than face the horror of survival. Aboard the Craftworlds, the survivors gathered in great halls to mourn. The cries of the bereaved filled those spaces, a collective wail of anguish unlike anything ever heard in Eldar history. Proud nobles who once composed poetry and music could only sob uncontrollably. Mighty warriors who had lived through millennia now trembled on their knees, tears streaming down their faces. In a single day, the Eldar had been reduced from lords of the galaxy to a broken remnant, and the weight of that loss was almost too much to bear. On some Craftworlds, the mourning took on ritual form. In one Craftworld's dome, a group of surviving Eldar elders keened a dirge that echoed through the Wraithbone halls, a sound of grief so profound that even the Infinity Circuit seemed to dim in sorrow. They mourned not just the dead, but the death of their entire way of life. Talk about a wake-up call. Unfortunately for the Eldar, the alarm came after the house had already burned down. Far from Eldar space, many of the Exodite worlds survived the fall intact. Distance and a simpler psychic presence spared them Slaanesh's direct wrath, as did many Craftworlds, their Wraithbone hulls and Infinity Circuits providing some protection against Slaanesh's howl. Already outside of real space, the pleasure cults of the mercantile city of Commorragh likewise survived. They were sheltered within the webway when Slaanesh struck. However, the degeneration of the Eldar did not go without lasting consequences for those survivors. The Eldar were now a scattered race, to be hunted by their great enemy for all eternity. They would never recover the glory of what was lost. In the immediate aftermath, the Eldar survivors splintered into the disparate sub-factions that persist to this day, each adapting to the new reality in their own way. The Craftworld Eldar, those on the world ships, formally abandoned the lifestyle of excess that had led to the fall. Traumatized by what had occurred, they swore never to walk that path again. They developed a new society built around discipline, self-denial, and the pursuit of excellence without corruption. The Craftworlders codified the path system. Now every Eldar would dedicate themselves wholly to a specific path or discipline, whether it be the path of the warrior, the poet, the seer, etc., focusing their life on duty and self-control to avoid the temptations of unbridled sensation. This rigid structure helps them keep their powerful emotions in check. Where once an Eldar might have freely explored any whim, now they walk carefully structured roads of contemplation and mastery. Furthermore, the Eldar refined their practice of war into an art bounded by discipline. Those who chose the path of the warrior did not merely indulge a love of battle. They adopted specific aspect warrior roles, each embodying a controlled facet of warfare and destruction. This was more than a cultural choice. It was necessitated by the revelation that the god of war, Cain, had literally left pieces of himself within their craft worlds. In the heart of each craft world lay a dormant avatar of Cain, a shard of the shattered war god, waiting to be roused in times of desperate need. The Eldar learned to awaken these fiery war avatars only with utmost caution and ceremony. For while an avatar of Cain could indeed turn the tide of battle in their favor, its bloody presence also served as a grim reminder of their broken pantheon and the fine line they must walk to avoid falling to bloodlust. By formalizing their methods of war and revering Cain's power in a restrained, ritualized way, the Craftworlders ensured that even their violence would not lead them back into the excess that birthed the great enemy. Alongside this, the survivors found practical means to defend their very souls. The Craftworld seers and artisans discovered how to craft spirit stones, also called waystones, psychically receptive gems worn by Eldar, to capture their soul at the moment of death, preventing Slaanesh from immediately devouring it. These spirit stones are then set into the Craftworld's infinity circuits, communal wraithbone matrices that house the souls of the departed, allowing the dead to rest in a protected state and even communicate with the living, rather than being consumed by she who thirsts. Armed with this knowledge, the Craftworld Eldar manage to persist as a people, though they are but a shadow of what they once were. Where once trillions lived, now perhaps only scattered millions remain aboard their majestic but lonely Craftworld ships. They wander the stars as nomads, aloof and sorrowful, fighting desperately to protect what is left of their kind from the many dangers of the galaxy, not least of which is the ceaseless hunger of Slaanesh. The Exodites, for their part, carried on upon their remote worlds with renewed dedication to austerity. Having been vindicated in their belief that indulgence would destroy their people, they doubled down on simple living, spirituality, and closeness to nature. Their lives are hard and rustic, by choice. Puritan might be an apt word. The Exodites' day-to-day existence might seem almost primitive compared to the glittering cities they left behind, but it sustains them. On their new maiden worlds, untamed planets of lush forests and rolling plains, they became self-sufficient farmers and hunters. Eldar, who once flew anti-gravity ships, now ride atop native draconic beasts through the jungles, guiding herds of megadonts, massive reptilian megafauna, or cultivating crops with simple tools. Their communities are tight-knit, governed by toil and tradition, rather than whimsy or ambition. Around campfire circles at night, Exodite elders retell the old myths of the gods and remind the young why their people had to abandon the old empire. By embracing hardship, they believe they are cleansing their souls of the sins that doomed their kin. Even the Exodites employ measures to guard against Slaanesh. Their worlds are often outfitted with world spirits, planetary infinity circuits that absorb the souls of the dead into the planet itself, thus keeping them out of Slaanesh's clutches. In this way, whether on a craft world or an Exodite world, the Eldar seek to deny she who thirsts her prize. Though lacking in material luxury, the Exodites find a measure of peace and clarity in their austere lifestyle, a peace they pray will keep Slaanesh's gaze from ever turning upon them. Meanwhile, a peculiar group known as the Harlequins endured the fall as well, protected by their patron Commorragh's trickery. In its aftermath, they emerged as wandering performers and warriors, serving as living repositories of Eldar history and the guardians of Eldar myth. The Harlequins appointed themselves keepers of the Eldar's tragic past. They roam between Craftworlds, Exodite colonies, and even the dark spires of Commorragh, performing elaborate dances and plays that reenact the rise and fall of their people. Their performances, equal parts celebration and warning, ensure that no Eldar forgets the lessons of the fall. When Harlequins take the stage wearing their eerie masks representing Eldar gods and heroes, even the most stoic Craftworld elder trembles at the retelling of the birth of She Who Thirsts. In battle, Harlequins are deadly, harnessing ancient knowledge and supernatural agility to confound and slaughter the enemies of the Eldar. They fight to protect the remnants of their people and to spite chaos whenever possible. To the Craftworlders and Exodites, Harlequins are spiritual guides, if unsettling ones. To the Dark Eldar, they are respected emissaries of the Laughing God, treating occasionally with the Lords of Commorragh on equal terms. In the Harlequins lies the last intact spark of the old Eldar pantheon, and through them the Eldar remember both the heights of their glory and the depths of their folly. Not all who survived chose or managed to remain pure. Already outside real space during the fall, the pleasure cultists of Commorragh, a colossal Eldar city hidden within the webway, found themselves largely untouched by Slaanesh's soul-sucking scream. They escaped the fate of their kin by a quirk of location, but they now faced a new horror. Like all Eldar, they were marked by Slaanesh's curse. Though alive, they began to feel their souls slowly withering, drawn towards She Who Thirsts over time. These decadent survivors soon discovered a horrific workaround. By inflicting exquisite pain and terror on others, they could siphon that psychic anguish to rejuvenate themselves. In essence, they learned to top off their soul's energy by consuming the misery of others, thus staving off the spiritual leeching of Slaanesh. Commorragh transformed into a nightmare city of eternal cruelty, where the decadent Eldar could continue their lifestyle of excess. But now every act of depravity was also a desperate act of self-preservation. They also swore off the use of psychic powers entirely. To use the warp directly would be to draw She Who Thirsts' gaze instantly. So the Dark Eldar, or Drukhari, became creatures of flesh and cunning alone, prolonging their unnaturally long lives indefinitely so long as they could keep feeding on pain. Of course, this ghastly existence comes at the expense of countless other beings whom they capture and torment. The Dark Eldar's society is a grotesque reflection of the pre-fall Eldar, one that preys on the rest of the galaxy to slake their never-ending thirst, a dark mirror to Slaanesh's own hunger. Amid this upheaval, a cunning Eldar named Asdrubal Vecht clawed his way to power in Commorragh. When the noble houses of that city were thrown into disarray by the psychic convulsions of the fall, Vecht seized the opportunity, freeing himself from servitude, eliminating rival archons, and positioning his own cabal to dominate the city. In the anarchy after the fall, figures like Vecht reorganized Commorragh into a new kind of Eldar empire, one ruled not by enlightenment or counsel, but by fear, strength, and the profit of suffering. Under Vecht's cold-blooded guidance, the Dark Eldar became firmly entrenched as predators lurking in the webway, ready to prey upon the weakened galaxy beyond. Now the dark city of Commorragh endures as the last homeworld of those Eldar who embraced darkness. They possess all the sadism and thirst for sensation that led to Slaanesh's birth, but they channel it outward, parasitically feeding on others to save themselves. They are, in a sense, the ultimate survivors of the Eldar fall, survivors who have become something less than Eldar and something more like demons themselves. And what of Slaanesh itself? The chaos god of excess sits ensconced in the warp, forever ravenous. From the moment of its birth, Slaanesh was the epitome of temptation and horror. In Eldar lore, she who thirsts is often depicted as breathtakingly beautiful and irresistibly alluring, neither male nor female, but an entrancing blend of both. Yet behind that beautiful facade lies a bottomless hunger. Slaanesh embodies temptation itself, the promise of ultimate pleasure that inevitably leads to ruin. Within its own infernal domain, the Palace of Pleasure in the realm of chaos, Slaanesh creates gardens of exquisite, poisonous delight. Every taste, sensation, and experience imaginable arrayed like bait for the souls it craves. Those lured into Slaanesh's embrace find an eternity of indulgence that quickly becomes endless suffering as the great enemy takes more and more from them, never satisfied. This is the power the Eldar birthed, a being whose every whisper can corrupt the purest heart, whose every caress brings ecstasy and oblivion in equal measure. To the Eldar, Slaanesh is not just a monster. It is the shadow of their own former selves, given will and predatory purpose. They call it she who thirsts, because nothing will ever quench its appetite for their souls. Slaanesh gained an eternal title to the souls of the Eldar. It is said that the Eldar soul belongs to Slaanesh by right, and only cunning or valor can avert that fate. Every time an Eldar dies without proper protection, their soul is drawn into the warp and devoured by Slaanesh's insatiable thirst. For the Eldar, this is the ultimate horror, their equivalent of damnation. It is a fate far worse than mere death, and it looms over every living Eldar at every moment. This is the price they pay for the folly of their ancestors, a debt of sin that can never truly be undone. The galaxy at large also continues to bear scars from the fall. The Empyrean, warp, remains imbalanced by the birth of Slaanesh. Chaos as a whole was empowered by the coming of this new god. The permanent warp rift, the Eye of Terror, remains as a giant, festering scar near the galactic core, pouring forth demons and providing a refuge for the darkest of humanity's traitors and renegades. In a cruel twist, the psychic eruption that destroyed the Eldar also blew away the warp storms that had made human interstellar travel impossible for millennia. In the calm after the psychic storm, the Emperor of Mankind was able to launch his great crusade, reunifying humanity and establishing the Imperium. One might say mankind ascended on the very graveyard of the Eldar Empire. The Eldar themselves know this all too well. Some among them take grim satisfaction that at least their sacrifice allowed younger civilizations to flourish, while others seethe with bitterness or weep to see primitive humans now swagger over worlds the Eldar once shaped. Most, however, simply watch with dread, for they see in the Imperium of Man echoes of the same arrogance and excess that once led the Eldar to ruin. 10,000 standard years have passed since the fall, and the Eldar endure. But they do so as a broken, vestigial people. They drift on their craft worlds, walk the hidden paths of the webway, or till the soil of distant maiden worlds. In total, perhaps only a few million Eldar now remain, a pitiful remnant compared to the uncountable trillions that once populated their empire. Each surviving Eldar carries the knowledge of what their race once was, and the unbearable guilt of what their race's actions unleashed. Every aspect of their existence is colored by that ancient disaster. Their art, their philosophy, their dwindling numbers, their frantic quests. There are even those among them now who whisper of a final, risky plan. A prophecy that one day a new Eldar god of the dead, Enead, might arise from the collective souls of the Eldar to defeat Slaanesh. It is a faint hope, but a hope nonetheless. The Eldar are a people of survivors and inheritors of guilt. They carry the burden of their forebears' excess, and they know that any slip back into the old ways could mean the end of them for good. The fall of the Eldar stands as perhaps the most devastating cautionary tale in galactic history. A civilization at its apex was consumed by the very thirst for sensation that had once made life feel rich and worth living. In seeking fulfillment without limit, they found oblivion. The echoes of that downfall still reverberate through the universe, in the whispers of a chaos god, in the desperate lives of the surviving Eldar, and in the very fabric of reality scarred by the birth of Slaanesh. The saga of the Eldar's fall is a stark reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, the greatest threats can arise not from some external enemy, but from the enemy within, from the flaws and hungers lurking in one's own heart. The Eldar learned this lesson in the most extreme and tragic way imaginable. They created their own destroyer, a fact the Eldar themselves acknowledge in their most sorrowful laments. In the Hall of Tears on Craftworld Uthway, a surviving Farseer etched these words: "In revelry we birthed a ruinous god. Our echoes of laughter became our eternal screams. Such is the legacy they must endure. Pleasure and pride proved to be more lethal to them than any weapon. An empire that had stood for millions of years imploded in one night of apocalyptic ecstasy and agony. Now the few remaining Eldar bear witness to the younger races of the galaxy and tremble to see echoes of their own past follies. They watch the Imperium of Man, brash, aggressive, and confident in its dominance, and they fear that one day humanity might succumb to a fate similar to theirs. The Eldar know all too well how a civilization's greatest strengths can become its undoing when arrogance and excess take hold. Perhaps in the quiet councils of their seer courts, the Eldar pray that mankind will avoid the trap that ensnared them. But if the long history of the galaxy proves anything, it's that pride and blindness are not faults unique to any one species. It turns out you actually can have too much of a good thing, a lesson the Eldar learned at the ultimate cost. However mighty you think you are, you cannot revel in damnation and escape the consequences. In the end, one simple truth stands clear. It was pleasure, unchecked and all-consuming, that destroyed the Eldar Empire. Far away in the void, one of the last craft worlds glides silently through the eternal night. Within its domed forests and echoing corridors, the survivors of a dead empire contemplate their fate. Once their people's laughter shook the stars. Now only hushed laments and determined whispers resound in those halls. The Craftworld's infinity circuit hums softly with the souls of the departed, a gentle glow in the wraithbone walls, and a constant reminder of all that was lost. Every Eldar aboard carries a spirit stone at their breast, their hope of denying Slaanesh the final victory when they die. Under the distant light of unfamiliar constellations, the Eldar endure, isolated, sorrowful, yet unbowed. They practice their arts, they wage their careful wars against the galaxy's many dangers, and they teach their children about the paradise that was and the horror that came after. They know their race will never be what it once was. Perhaps it may not even survive the millennia to come. A faction among them, the mysterious Inari, works toward a final desperate salvation, the prophesied awakening of Enead, the god of death, who might one day defeat Slaanesh and free the Eldar from their curse. It is a slim hope, but it is hope nonetheless. Nevertheless, the Eldar persevere, scarred and humbled, but also wiser, determined that the galaxy will not easily forget the cautionary tale of the Eldar Empire, how it was glorious, how it fell, and the terrible price that was paid for one moment of unchecked pleasure.